Billions of dollars were on the table. None of it was going to the WTA. Brands were not just chasing Eala, they were quietly, deliberately, and methodically abandoning the entire tour. A 19-year-old from the Philippines had become more commercially valuable than a professional circuit that had spent 5 decades building its institutional identity, not through Grand Slam dominance, not through ranking supremacy, through something far more dangerous to the establishment, something that cannot be manufactured, cannot be packaged, and absolutely cannot be controlled: pure, uncontrollable cultural magnetism. And when the financial numbers began surfacing, the tennis world did not simply raise its eyebrows, it held its breath. Because what was unfolding in corporate boardrooms from Manila to Manhattan was not a sponsorship story. It was a power shift, a quiet corporate revolution dressed in a tennis skirt, and the WTA never saw it coming. Stay locked in, because by the time this is over, you will understand why the most important battle in women's tennis right now is not happening on any court in the world. There is a particular kind of athlete who transcends their sport before the sport fully recognizes them. Muhammad Ali did it. Serena Williams did it. And now, whether the WTA establishment welcomes it or not, Eala is doing it on a scale that has left corporate strategists completely restructuring their marketing blueprints in real time. Born in the Philippines, shaped by relentless discipline, and developed at the Rafael Nadal Academy in Mallorca, Eala carried something into professional tennis that no coaching manual has ever been able to teach. She carried a story, a genuine, cross-continental, multi-generational story that resonated simultaneously with billions of people across Southeast Asia, Europe, and the Americas. That combination, the underdog geography, the elite European training ground, the infectious authenticity, the irresistible personality, created what marketing executives are privately calling a perfect cultural convergence. And corporations noticed it long before the WTA rankings caught up with the reality. By the time Eala was breaking through on the professional circuit, her social media following had already outpaced dozens of players ranked significantly above her. Her Instagram engagement rates were not simply strong for a tennis player. They were strong for any athlete in any discipline on any continent. Brands measuring authentic audience connection, not just raw follower counts, but genuine emotional investment from real, breathing, loyal communities, were looking at data that made their analysts run the numbers twice. Sportswear corporations, luxury watchmakers, technology giants, telecommunications companies with enormous Southeast Asian consumer bases. They were not casually interested. They were competing aggressively, urgently, and with growing financial seriousness. And crucially, and this is the detail that changes everything, these conversations were not flowing through WTA partnership channels. They were going directly to Eala's representation, bypassing the tour entirely. And that distinction matters more than almost anything else in this story. The WTA operates on a traditional sports marketing infrastructure that was brilliantly designed and functioned exceptionally well for decades. Centralized sponsorships, official tour partnerships, revenue structures built around the collective power of the whole. It was a model constructed for a specific era, and in that era, it worked. But it was built before a single athlete could command more digital attention than the entire organization promoting her. It was built before the concept of a player whose individual brand gravity was powerful enough to pull sponsors directly out of the tour's orbit. Eala represented something the traditional model had simply never accounted for. She was not working against the system. She was not staging a rebellion. She was just existing, connecting with audiences on a frequency and with an emotional depth that the WTA's institutional voice could not come close to matching. And the money followed the connection. The money always follows the connection. Inside tennis circles, the whispers began multiplying with alarming speed. Agents representing other players started hearing from brand partners that budget allocations were being quietly reassessed. Tournament sponsors began receiving notably cooler responses to partnership renewal proposals. The money was not disappearing from women's tennis altogether. It was concentrating, pooling, flowing with increasing velocity toward one singular point of cultural gravity. And that point had a name. That point had a smile that could stop a room and a backhand that could stop a conversation. And that point was just getting started. Ask yourself a simple question. When was the last time a teenager made billion-dollar corporations completely rethink their entire sports marketing strategy from the ground up? Because that moment had already arrived, and the WTA was still trying to understand what it was looking at. Numbers have a way of escaping the rooms they were never meant to leave. The figures being discussed in private negotiations surrounding Eala's individual sponsorship portfolio were not modest, mid-tier endorsement arrangements. These were not the standard deals that professional tennis players outside the top 10 typically secure. What was circulating in confidential term sheets and preliminary agreements represented a category of financial commitment normally reserved for established, multiple Grand Slam champions with a decade of top-level performance behind them. Reports emerging from sports business circles indicated that individual brand offers, when projected across multi-year commitments and combined across multiple partnerships, created a total portfolio value measured not in millions but in the billions. A telecommunications giant with massive Southeast Asian market penetration was reportedly among the front runners. Multiple sportswear corporations, fully understanding the cultural footprint Eala commanded across one of the fastest-growing consumer demographics on Earth, entered serious discussions. Technology companies seeking authentic ambassador voices in emerging markets viewed her not as one option among several, but as irreplaceable. What made these offers truly extraordinary was not simply the scale, it was the structure. Brands were not approaching Eala's team asking how she might fit into existing WTA-adjacent partnership frameworks. They were constructing entirely custom arrangements from scratch. Creative collaborations, ownership stakes, long-term ambassador architectures that treated her as a media entity in her own right, rather than simply another athlete available for product placement. One sports marketing analyst speaking to industry publications described the situation with striking directness. Brands had essentially concluded that the emotional audience connection Eala generated was more efficiently and more authentically accessed by going around the tour than through it. The WTA's official partnership infrastructure, while valuable for reaching broad tennis audiences, simply could not deliver the specific, intensely loyal, culturally specific communities that followed Eala personally and with the kind of devotion that brands dream about. For the WTA, this reality carried consequences that were not abstract or theoretical. They were financial, they were structural, and they were immediate. When corporations redirect sponsorship capital away from organizational partnerships toward individual athlete deals outside tour structures, the collective loses leverage. Other players lose visibility. Smaller tournaments lose their funding pipelines. The entire ecosystem feels the pressure from the top all the way down to the players grinding through the second and third tiers of the professional circuit who will never command a billion-dollar personal portfolio but who need the collective infrastructure to survive professionally. And here is the dimension that truly sharpened the tension inside WTA offices. Eala was not engineering the situation. She was not positioning herself adversarially against any institution. Her representation was simply responding to extraordinary market demand with appropriate commercial strategy. That is not rebellion, that is business. But the consequences for the WTA were identical regardless of intent. And inside the tour, the uncomfortable conversations had already begun. How does an organization retain sponsorship relevance when one of its own members has become a more attractive individual investment than the collective platform? How do you restructure commercial frameworks built for a pre-social media world to accommodate an athlete whose personal audience dwarfs institutional reach? These were not hypothetical, long-term strategic questions anymore. They required immediate, sophisticated answers. And the WTA, for reasons that would soon become very public, seemed to be searching for those answers with a speed that matched nothing the urgency of the moment demanded. The billion-dollar question was not whether Eala deserved these offers. Nobody seriously disputed that. The question tearing through tennis boardrooms was far more unsettling. Had the WTA already lost the commercial narrative? And if so, could they ever fully reclaim it? Silence in moments of institutional crisis is never truly silent. It communicates everything, loudly and unmistakably. While brand negotiations surrounding Eala were intensifying and sports business media was beginning to publicly connect the dots, the WTA's official communication channels remained conspicuously, almost theatrically quiet. No formal acknowledgement, no strategic positioning statement, no visible effort to reframe the commercial conversation on their own terms. Just institutional stillness at precisely the moment when decisive, confident action was most urgently required. And that stillness was catastrophic. In the modern media environment, an organization's failure to control its own narrative does not simply create a vacuum. It hands the microphone to everyone else, and everyone else was not inclined to be generous. Tennis journalists, sports marketing analysts, fan communities across multiple continents, and competing sports entities all rushed to fill the interpretive space the WTA left empty. The story being constructed in their absence was not flattering. It portrayed a governing body caught completely flat-footed by a shift that, looking backward, had been visible for years to anyone paying attention. The internal structural reasons for the delayed response were understandable in isolation, but inexcusable in combination. The WTA balances competing interests across multiple jurisdictions: players, tournaments, broadcasters, and established corporate partners, all pulling simultaneously in different directions. Decision-making within that framework moves deliberately. In normal circumstances, that deliberateness reflects responsible governance. But the circumstances surrounding Eala's commercial explosion were anything but normal, and deliberateness in the face of a fast-moving crisis looks indistinguishable from paralysis. Meanwhile, individual sponsors growing skeptical of the WTA's strategic positioning began exploring conversations that months earlier would have seemed unimaginable. Brands that had maintained stable, mutually beneficial tour partnerships for years were suddenly asking fundamental questions about return on investment. Were WTA-adjacent placements still reliably reaching the audiences brands needed most? Or had those audiences migrated, following specific athletes, specific stories, specific cultural moments, away from institutional channels entirely? The answers those brands were receiving from their own internal analytics were deeply uncomfortable for tour leadership. Digital data does not negotiate. Audience migration statistics do not respect legacy partnerships. And the overwhelming conclusion of multiple independent commercial assessments was consistent and damning. The WTA's ability to deliver certain high-value audience segments had measurably weakened. Eala's individual platforms had simultaneously grown stronger with every passing week. The math was not complicated. The implications were enormous. Players across the tour began noticing the downstream effects with a clarity that no official statement could obscure. Conversations with potential personal sponsors were shifting in tone. Brand representatives who previously referenced WTA partnership alignment as a meaningful positive signal were now mentioning it with qualifications that had not appeared before. Veteran players speaking anonymously to sports journalists expressed genuine frustration that cut to the heart of the matter. They had invested entire careers building the WTA's collective commercial reputation. The idea that institutional silence during a pivotal transition moment was potentially undoing years of shared effort felt to many like a profound, unforgivable failure of leadership. And still, officially, nothing. The corporate departures, when they came, did not announce themselves dramatically. Institutional sponsorship erosion never operates that way. It happens through renewal conversations that quietly fail to reach conclusions, through option clauses that expire without activation, through partnership agreements that simply are not extended with the enthusiasm or at the financial levels they previously commanded. Gradually, then suddenly, the commercial foundation began showing fractures. Multiple brands with long-established WTA presence began redirecting meaningful portions of their sports marketing budgets toward individual athlete partnerships entirely outside tour structures. The calculus was straightforward, and from a purely commercial perspective, entirely rational. Audience engagement metrics around specific players, Eala being the most dramatic example, but not the only one, consistently outperformed tour-wide placement data. For brands optimizing every marketing dollar against measurable audience response, the conclusion was not complicated. They were simply following the audience. The tournament ecosystem felt this immediately and painfully. Smaller WTA events, which depend disproportionately on sponsorship revenue relative to broadcast income, began operating under tighter financial constraints. Prize fund discussions became more complicated. The operational infrastructure supporting hundreds of players across the professional circuit The players who would never command individual billion-dollar portfolios, but who formed the competitive backbone making elite women's tennis possible, started feeling genuine economic pressure. This dimension of the story rarely received the prominent coverage it deserved. The headline narrative focused on Eala's extraordinary commercial ascent, which was genuinely extraordinary and genuinely deserving of coverage. The quieter, more consequential story was what her gravitational commercial pull was costing the players who would never directly benefit from it. A mid-ranked player competing in a second-tier WTA event gains nothing from Eala's sponsorship negotiations, but she loses something very real if those negotiations redirect collective funding away from the infrastructure sustaining her career. Several prominent voices within the tennis community began raising this point publicly, always carefully, always without directing frustration toward Eala personally. The situation was not her creation, but the structural consequences were falling on people who had nothing to do with creating them either. And then came the interview that nobody predicted. The moment that cut through every layer of institutional narrative and landed directly in the global public consciousness like a perfectly struck winner down the line. In an interview that circulated across platforms with stunning velocity, Eala addressed the commercial situation surrounding her career with a directness and a measured composure that caught virtually every observer completely off guard. She was not hostile. She was not performing grievance or manufacturing controversy for attention. Her tone was thoughtful and controlled in a way that somehow made her words hit harder than any emotional outburst could have. She spoke about representing something larger than individual achievement, about understanding that her visibility carried genuine responsibility toward the communities, Filipino, Southeast Asian, young women globally, who saw themselves reflected in her journey. About navigating commercial opportunities in ways that honored that responsibility while also asserting something that needed to be said plainly. Her value, her authentic cultural currency, deserved acknowledgement on terms that actually reflected reality. And then she said the thing that stopped the entire conversation cold. She acknowledged, without bitterness, but with absolute clarity, that the structures surrounding professional women's tennis had not been designed with athletes like her in mind. Athletes whose commercial appeal derived primarily from cross-cultural resonance rather than pure ranking achievement. Athletes whose audience relationships existed independently of institutional frameworks. Athletes who, by simply existing authentically, challenged fundamental assumptions about how value gets measured and distributed in professional sports. Those words traveled everywhere simultaneously. Sports media amplified them within hours. Marketing industry publications analyzed them with genuine intellectual fascination. Fan communities across Southeast Asia responded with fierce, emotional, overwhelming pride and recognition. Tennis audiences globally engaged in sprawling debates about structural fairness, commercial equity, and institutional accountability that generated tens of millions of interactions across every major platform simultaneously. What made the moment so genuinely powerful was not its confrontational quality, because it was not confrontational. It was the profound reasonableness of everything Eala was expressing. Nobody listening could seriously dismiss her perspective as naive or self-serving. The structural observations she articulated were accurate, verifiable, and reflected concerns that players, analysts, and sports economists had been discussing privately for years. Having a 19-year-old at the very center of the storm articulate them with that quality of quiet precision was something the tennis world had simply never seen before. The WTA's response arrived late and read as defensive rather than reflective. Measured observers noted what a genuinely confident, self-aware organization would have engaged Eala's observations with intellectual seriousness rather than institutional deflection. The contrast between her composure and the organization's awkward positioning only deepened the public sympathy flowing in her direction. Social media fan communities, particularly across the Philippines and broader Southeast Asia, transformed the moment into something that transcended sports. Clips from the interview accumulated hundreds of millions of views across platforms. Hashtags surrounding her name dominated trending conversations for consecutive days. International media outlets that rarely devoted meaningful space to women's tennis suddenly ran prominent feature stories examining what Eala represented not just for her sport, but for the broader conversation about cultural representation, commercial equity, and the changing architecture of global sports marketing. And through all of it, through every headline and every viral clip and every corporate negotiation happening in rooms she was not sitting in, Eala remained composed, gracious, and focused on tennis, while the commercial and institutional world swirled around her like a storm she had not started and was not steering. That composure, arguably more than any specific statement she made, communicated something profound about her character, and it made her even more attractive to the brands already pursuing her with unprecedented financial commitment. Because brands do not just buy audiences, they buy character, they buy credibility. They buy the kind of person you trust standing next to your product in front of the entire world. And Eala, at 19 years old, projects all of that effortlessly. One question was now pulsing through every conversation about women's tennis, and nobody could quiet it. Was this a temporary turbulence that the WTA would weather and emerge from intact? Or had something permanently, fundamentally, irreversibly shifted in the commercial and cultural architecture of the sport? The honest answer, the one that sports economists and brand strategists and veteran tennis insiders were arriving at independently from different directions, was deeply challenging for the establishment to absorb. Eala did not start a war with the WTA. She simply became too large, too commercially potent, too culturally significant for the existing structure to comfortably contain. Brands followed authentic value because that is what brands do. Audiences follow genuine connection because that is what audiences have always done. And an institution built for a previous era found itself commercially outpaced, narratively outmaneuvered, and structurally unprepared, all by a teenager carrying an entire nation's sporting ambitions and dreams on her shoulders with a grace and a dignity that makes the whole spectacle even more extraordinary to witness. The numbers do not lie. The departing sponsors do not negotiate sentiment. The audiences migrating toward personal connection over institutional affiliation are not coming back simply because a press release requests it. Something fundamental has shifted in women's tennis. The question now is not whether the WTA will adapt. It is whether they will adapt fast enough to matter. Because the revolution, quiet as it has been, is already complete. The court has rendered its verdict, and the player holding match point is not the one the establishment expected. Now, we want to hear from you because you are part of this story too. Do you think the WTA can realistically recover its commercial standing? Or has the sponsorship tide shifted permanently toward individual athletes like Eala? Should the tour completely restructure how it shares revenue and recognition with players who generate disproportionate individual commercial value? And what does this entire story tell us about the future of professional sports marketing in a world where a single athlete with the right cultural connection can outvalue an entire institution? Drop everything you are thinking in the comments below right now. If this story genuinely moved you, if you believe Eala's journey deserves every bit of the recognition and the investment it is attracting, then hit that like button and make sure you subscribe. Because the biggest chapters in women's tennis are being written in real time, and you do not want to miss a single word of what comes next. Share this video with every tennis fan you know. The conversation needs to be louder. We will see you in the next one.